thank you so much, everyone, for coming out tonight. I'm going to start with a short reading before we go into conversation. So, Before the Mango Ripens is my debut novel, and it's about a town in West Africa. It takes place in the 1970s, and it's about a town in West Africa, Nigeria, central Nigeria, that's grappling with the presence of American missionaries. And it follows 5 central characters. 3 of them are Nigerian, and 2 of them are American, and it weaves their perspectives throughout, and the conflicts and tensions that arise. So I will be reading just a short section, chapter 28. And before I read, I also want to thank Chaucer's for hosting. This is my last stop on my tour. So I did an East Coast tour. I was in New Jersey, New York, Baltimore, and Iowa City as well. And then I came here and I did LA this past weekend. And so this is my last stop. So I'm really excited, not to end the tour, but just to connect with people in a different town, people in Santa Barbara. So thank you so much for having me. So chapter 28 was inspired by Toni Morrison's Sula. So there's a section in Sula that I really love where she says, "Summer came, a summer limp with a weight of blossomed things." And she goes on in this paragraph to describe what that summer was like. And in my novel, it takes place right before rainy season. And rain is really important. And rain, the coming of rain acts like a clock in the novel. And so I thought to myself once when I was stuck and trying to write and I wasn't having any ideas come one day, I thought, I really like this paragraph. What if I said rain came instead of summer came? And let's see what comes from that. And so sometimes you do it just to be inspired and not to necessarily have it show up in your novel, but it ended up showing up in my novel and I ended up being able to use it. So chapter 28. Rain came. It loosened fallow soil, pounding the earth with a force unlike anything Rabata had ever seen. In the faraway valleys, the palm trees swayed under the torrent. Leaves swelled, raindrops soaking into branches and roots. The serrated leaves of banana plants, once desiccated, greened and widened, flapping in the breeze. The storms brought the delicacies of rainy season. Women hung fluorescent tubes over buckets of water and swatted swarms of termites that whirred around the lights. Farmers searched for termite mounds. They dug through the soil, plucking the insects' wings and towing small bucketfuls home for their wives and children. In the evenings, the crackling of roasted termites frying in skillets merged with the sound of ceaseless rain. On the roadside, women worked while swaddled in wrappers or shaded under wooden sheds, selling their goods despite the rain threatening their fires and splattering their oil. Their children ran to school in the upending baptismal stream. After school, these same children tramped in the rain with friends, licking droplets from their lips, playing and singing, "Rain, rain, go away, rain, rain, go away. Come again another day, little Walu wants to play." At night, when the townspeople slept, the children's refrain became a resounding and urgent prayer. Farmers, previously pleased with the rains, worried that too much of it might damage the crops. These men who had never stepped into the church for service found themselves awake on Sunday mornings, walking to the school to pray to the white man's God. On another side of town, the waters rose, flowing into homes. The same singing children ran to see the flooding, to see the water foamy and gushing, swirling around the mud houses, to see the men and women wading in the water that rose to their calves, rushing to save their belongings, carrying pots on their shoulders and sleeping mats rolled under their arms. And the church that the men had built so close to rainy season, stood a ruined fortress in the storm. Thank you.
Wow, that was fantastic. So, congratulations on your debut novel, bringing it out into the world. I'm very honored to be here with you and Chaucer's to discuss this book tonight. Personally, I found your storytelling to be brilliant. It was very tangible. I think they have a sense of that now, vivid, and it came to life as the scenes were unfolding. So where did the idea for this novel come from? And how did you go about rendering this particular world so vibrantly?
So the idea for the novel, it was originally a short story that took place in the 1990s in America. It was called American Wife. So it was very different from what it turned into. So the protagonist of that short story, I became interested in his history and his background. And so I was thinking to myself, who's this protagonist's father? And so I started following and going into the 70s. So at some point with this novel, I had two parallel narratives. I had something happening in the 70s and unfolding in the 70s, and also something unfolding in the 90s. But I was more compelled by what was happening in the 70s. And so in 2015, I went back home to Nigeria to visit my relatives, and I ended up conducting interviews with my relatives about growing up in the 70s. And this was also a time where I got to speak with my grandfather before he passed, and I had hours of interviews with him as well, because when missionaries came to central Nigeria, especially our town and village, it was in the early 1900s, and there was so much that was lost when it came to traditional African religion, or when it came to, like medicines that we would use. There was a lot that was lost, a lot that was seen as evil, right? Or stated that it was evil. And so my grandfather was sharing things as it was before the missionaries came. So that was a really, really great and stimulating conversation. And then my uncle told a story about one of my relatives in that time who would go on excursions with a missionary, and when the missionary got tired, my relative would carry the missionary on his back. And this was something that really bothered me, and my uncle was like completely unmoved by this story for some reason. He was like, oh yeah, that's how things happened. But I ended up writing into it, and I ended up saying, it ends up being a really central image in the novel, but I wanted to turn it on its head. So what I had was that Zanya, who's one of the central characters, he's a laborer, he's charismatic, he's kind of pitted against Reverend Jim, but he ends up saving Reverend Jim's life by carrying him to Rabata when Reverend Jim has been robbed. And this is something that really bothers the Reverend. He's really upset that he's come to save these people, so to speak, and it's turned around that they save his life. So that was something I was really interested in playing with, but that's how it came to be. So short story, American Wife, and now Before the Mango Ripens in the 1970s.
Oh.
And it also took 10 years to write as well. So
that's great. So the shifting points of you in this novel are very distinct, but very fluid. And you treat each voice and character with the same amount of respect and empathy. How did you go about getting to this place?
So that's what one of the compliments that people generally give me about the book, like, oh, I really like these characters, they're complex, and sometimes people will whisper to me like, oh, Catherine is the matriarch of one of the missionary families, like, I know she's racist, but I kind of like her, and there's this, and I love that, or they'll say the same thing with Reverend Jim, like, oh, I don't think I should like him, but I'm kind of compelled by him. And I'm like, yeah, because he's human, and I wanted to humanize people. I didn't want to villainize anyone. I didn't want to have the townspeople be saints, and neither did I want to have the missionaries be villains. I just wanted people to show up in their humanity, in their fullness, because that's what we all are, right? Like, we are all liars and truth tellers, and we are all jealous and angry, but then also compassionate, and some of this in the same day, right? Where we wake up one way and the day another. And so that's what I wanted to bring, the fact that because someone has a particular title does not really show you the depth and the breadth of who they are.
I think you did it very well.
Thank you.
So speaking of the different characters, I felt personally most connected to Tabea and Jumai. Did these two characters become larger than life for you as well? Like, for me, I could feel their strengths, and even though their histories and their backgrounds were very, very different, they had a lot of the same types of strengths and power that they were almost seemingly unaware of. So I wanted to know like how you developed those two in particular, and if you saw them as kind of parallel characters in any way.
So Tabeya is a physician in the mission clinic. So when I wrote the novel, I focused on the 3 institutions that missionaries usually build when they go to a particular town, which is a church, a school, and a clinic. And so Tabeya is a physician in the clinic, and she was educated abroad. And the locals think she's funny acting and has strange behaviors about her because she was educated in Ireland and comes back and she's unmarried and she kind of does her own thing and she's not really interested in, she kind of pushes against the societal boundaries. And then you have Jumai, who's a domestic worker for one of the missionary families, for the Parsons, for Catherine Parson, the person I mentioned earlier. And so she's very, she comes from a blended family, and she comes from, Tabeya comes from an incredibly wealthy family, and Jumai is the opposite, where she comes from a family where, you know, they're struggling day to day. So when I wrote these 2 characters, I was really interested in exploring and thinking about women who could push back in a patriarchal society. And so Jumai does so in her own way. So whether or not she has like the economic means to do so, she's able to do so with the dreams that she has for herself, for the fact that, you know, there's a way that her story unfolds and there's a particular path people might think that she's going to take, and she chooses, you know, a completely opposite path. And the same thing with Tabeya. I actually modeled Tabeya on one of the first female physicians in Nigeria, Chief Elizabeth. So she was a physician in the early 1900s, and she also was educated in Dublin as well. And so I wanted her to have that energy and that idea of progress in the town. So I think they are, you know, similar to each other in the things that they desire and in the things they want, but they go about it differently because of the opportunities that have been either given to them or taken away from them.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so Reverend Jim, the pastor in the mission, and Catherine, the nurse at the local clinic, were both also integral to the story, and you've mentioned them both, representing the U.S. Christian missionary perspective. They also came to life for me, but in a far less sympathetic manner. I didn't trust them. I didn't like them. They had hidden agendas, and despite abundant evidence to the contrary, they typically viewed everyone around them as inferior. So I know life is not black and white, and can you tell me a little bit about how, in these 2 challenging characters, you were able to bring out more of the gray in those 2?
So I enjoyed writing Catherine's character. She was a lot of fun to write, actually. And part of it is because, I mean, as a writer, you want your characters to be uncomfortable. Put them in situations where in environments where things can act upon them, whether it's emotionally or like with their own minds, or whether it's actually physically acting upon them, or socially acting upon them. And for Catherine, all of these things are acting upon her. Spiritually, she's struggling because she doesn't have the same spiritual zeal as her husband, who's the one who wants to be in Nigeria. So Catherine actually does not want to be there. So her environment is like attacks her in a way constantly. Like she wakes up daily, and she also works at the mission clinic. So there are things that she sees that really, you know, bother her and get to her as well. And I think for me, because she was so fun for me to write in bringing out her jealousies and bringing out, there's the fact that her husband could possibly be sleeping with another missionary on the field as well. So, you know, there are all of these things happening that I wanted, you know, to bring out, to act upon her. So I think that she doesn't have an agenda until the end, you know, when she's kind of desperate to leave. So I think initially she's going with it, but when an opportunity presents itself, I think she takes it. And with Reverend Jim, you know, Reverend Jim leaves his U.S. congregation in disgrace to come to Nigeria. And he's seen it as rebirth. He's seen it as a time of, you know, I'm retired now and I want to start life over. And he has strained relationships with his sons. And so I think it's an escape for him. But what he ends up finding is that life almost unfolds in the way that in what he was trying to escape. So that makes sense. He's trying to escape one particular thing. He goes, across the Atlantic and is met with something similar. And so for me, I think the fact that he's lost his wife and the fact that he's, leaves his congregation in disgrace, those were things I wanted to give him to complicate who he was.
So it's a very deliberate, complicating.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so last character I want to touch on, you mentioned him earlier, is Zanya. So I'll tell you, if I had been watching this as a TV series, Zanya would have needed a spin-off, a sequel, because he's very lively, he's full of potential, talent, charisma, yet he often seemed to have difficulty navigating the interpersonal and political dynamics of his life. How did his character come into existence, and what did he represent to you in the story?
So Zanya's character came as the father. He was the father of the original protagonist.
Oh.
And the scene that came with me with Zanya is that he's in a church building speaking that's half built. It's not complete yet. It is complete. But he's in that building speaking with his fiance, and he's bitter. He's really resentful. And I kind of wanted to explore that. Why is he so angry? And part of it was because he felt that the missionaries used his body for labor and completely overlooked his intellect and saw him as spiritually inferior, which was the attitude and posture of missionaries back then in the 60s and 70s, right? I mean, there were still, missionaries going abroad who were reading journals that said that Europeans were of the advanced race. And so then you're going in with these kind of racist attitudes and so how do you minister to a people? So anyway, that was a whole thing that Zanya was concerned about with Zanya. And I think for me, Zanya also represents, which I talk about in the second chapter, represents what the young men would have been feeling at that time in Nigeria. So this takes place in 1971. And Nigeria's independence was in 1960. So we're from Britain, and so it's about 11 years after independence. So there's a excitement about what could be, possibilities and potential. And I think Zanya represents that. And during this time, there was also a government takeover of institutions. So the Nigerian government was starting to take over the Western institutions in the country, and that's also a representation for Zanya, who wants more power in the church, along with Tebeya, who wants more power in the mission clinic. So what these characters are representing is what was happening politically at that time.
Interesting.
Okay, so I'll ask a couple more questions about your writing process, and then turn it over to the audience for a few questions. Can you tell us about the research that you did for this novel? I know some of it was interviewing your family, but since it's a work of historical fiction, what other sorts of research did you take on?
There was a lot of research that was done for this novel. So I think that of all the research you do, when you end up writing a novel, I feel like you only use 20% or 30% of all the research that you do. And the thing with writing historical fiction is that almost every line you feel like you have to double check to make sure it's factual, to make sure it's there's a high fidelity to that particular decade. And so there's something Catherine says to Tebeya, and she basically, makes a reference to the green giant, who's a mascot for peas in the US, right? And you write that line, but you have to stop and say, oh, but was it actually available at that time? So there's all this, so you're not as free to write, I would say. But the research I did for this, aside from the interviews with family, the interviews with my grandfather, was that I interviewed for about 7 hours a missionary couple that had been in Nigeria for 30 years. In the 70s, and he had been a physician. I read memoirs from missionaries who had also been in the country, 300-page memoirs. I did research on the government takeovers. There are Zanya as a laborer So I did research about laborers. There's a strike that happens in the novel. I did research on strikes at that time. I did research, I did archival research where I read letters from Vera Thiessen, who was a missionary nurse in the Congo in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. So even though it's a different nation, it still gives you a flavor of the time. She wrote letters to her mother, and just on these like blue, okay, do we actually see, we had the actual physical letters and like had them scanned. So we ended up reading through all of those letters, and then when I was back in Nigeria, I was able to get a book. So the missionaries that came to Nigeria, or made inroads, I would say, to Nigeria, was the Sudan Interior Mission. It's now known as the Serving Interior Mission, and they were actually in the news recently for something upsetting, but they ended up coming in, and there was a book that my grandfather gave me that talked about the history of the Sudan Interior Mission in Nigeria from 1893 to 1993, where they built about like 120 mission stations. So this book like covered all of that. I was also had books on the Baigi people. That's my particular ethnic group in Nigeria. So there were folk tales and myths, a book of folk tales that was given to me as well, and also a book of proverbs. So there are all of these things that I was really interested in like bringing into the novel. So there were a lot of primary resources, like the interviews, but then secondary resources that I was looking at. And I'm sure I've forgotten many other research articles that I looked at.
Tell us about the title of your novel. What does it mean?
So Before the Mango Ripens is based on a Baigi proverb. The actual proverb says, before the ripening of fruit, what were the birds eating? And so that means we can do without. So before the fruit ripened on the trees, the birds were able to survive. And whether or not there is fruit on the trees, the birds find a way to survive. And so this is something that Kago, one of the laborers, says to Zanya. And what he means is, before the missionaries came, we had our own political systems, our own religious beliefs, our own ways of life. And whether or not they remain, we will survive. But I also think Before the Mango Ripens represents politically where the nation was, like Nigeria was before the mango ripens, like ripening towards something, progressing towards something. I think the characters as well, they're all searching for their dreams. They're all hungry for something, and those dreams haven't yet come to fruition. And so I think they too are before the mango ripens. And then, this book touches on themes of faith and spirituality and Christianity. Fruit represents like spiritual progress and spiritual maturity. And I think the characters in their own way, with the tensions that the missionaries bring, are also exploring their own spirituality. And I think that's Before the Mango Ripens. And so I think that there's a multiplicity of meanings through the title, but the literal meaning comes from a Baigi proverb.
Okay. And the last one for me, before you guys get your chance, is what's one thing you're especially proud of as it relates to this debut?
I always say that I finished it. I'm proud of. But I mean, this was 10 years, of labor and 10 years of work. And I think people sometimes have they have a fantasy of what it means to be a writer and a fantasy of the creative life. And I'm like, that's not what it is at all. I mean, you might have moments where you're so excited about a scene, it feels like that's like 20% of it. Back to my 2080 thing, but 80% of it, there's so much that you're pushing to complete. And so like all the labor and work that went into this, all the pages that were lost, I lost about 1,000 pages writing this novel. Because it was American Wife at one point, and I'd written 300 pages of that before I went in a different direction, and then I lost like 200 and 300 more pages of that. And at some point, this novel was about 600 pages, and then now it's 336 pages. So there's so much that's lost as well, or not lost, maybe saved. Maybe there'll be a sequel. But there's so much that you do, and what you realize as an author is that there are times when you're writing for yourself and not necessarily for the reader. And so there are times where you'll write chapters and you'll write things that you think you're going to use, but you realize, oh, I wrote this so I could better understand this particular character. And now that I understand them, what the reader needs is just a line of dialogue. what the reader needs is just 3 sentences. And so that's what you realize as you're writing, and that's my particular process. But yes, I am glad that it's a book that you can hold in your hand. So.
Me too. So, any questions? I know Bree probably has.
Will there be an audiobook soon?
Yes, thank you for
Ah.
asking. The audiobook drops on the 26th, so is that next week?
Yeah.
Yes, next
Are you
Tuesday.
doing it?
No, there's an actress, Dele Ogundiran, who's Nigerian American, and she'll be doing it. I don't know if I would have done a good job with it.
You don't have to answer this, of course.
Yeah.
What is your relationship with Christianity?
That's a good one. So I do identify as a Christian, and I think that, I have I wouldn't say a complicated relationship with Christianity. I have a relationship where I interrogate Christianity, which is what I think leads me to be able to write this book. So I'll say that what I've seen done in the past is that you either have someone who's Nigerian, someone who's African, who's just naive, and they're like a simpleton, and they just go with, all the religious beliefs of the white man, of the oppressor, or it's the other extreme, where what you have is someone who outright rejects Christianity, is angry, throws it away because this is a tool of the oppressor. And what I was interested in is what I've actually seen in my own family or with other people, where there's an intelligence in saying, this was given and brought this particular way, but how do I choose to relate to this particular faith? So that's something I was interested in exploring, because I've seen the questions in my own family. I've seen the tensions in my own family. And I think that as a woman of color, these are things you grapple with constantly. You wake up and you grapple with what it means to have, to believe as a Christian, but to also wake up daily and face certain things that have you questioning your faith and what your faith might call you to. So I think with the characters, that was something I was interested in complicating for them. And there's this Frederick Douglass quote that I really love, where he says, I hate the Christianity of this land. I hate the slave whipping, misogynistic Christianity of this land, but I love the peaceful Christianity of Christ. And I always think of that tension for people, there's one way it presents, and then there's another way it presents if you read the text. And so I think there's a tension there as well. And there's Lamin Sane is a Gambian theologian, and he wrote the book called Whose Religion is Christianity? Because he was trying to talk about this very thing. He was saying this is something that's overlooked, for Africans. People believe oh, well, this is how it came to you. This is not something that you should believe. But Christianity was on the African continent in the 1st century. It was on the continent in the 4th century. It was brought by Frumentius, a Syrian refugee who, converted King Ezana of Ethiopia, and then he ended up building churches throughout, the continent. And then, the Portuguese came to Nigeria in the 14th century, and the King of Benin sent Nigerian scholars to Portugal to study and understand Christianity. And then so many of the church fathers, even though you think that they might be white, are actually, Augustine, Tertullian, are not, And so I think there are all of these complications around it. And I think that in some way it has been whitewashed, and people don't always understand the history, particularly in Africa. So this was something I was completely interested in exploring.
So I have a question.
Okay.
So I don't have a fantasy of what it's like to be a LGBT, but the whole process interests me because it's very lonely process, and also takes a lot of courage to throw away hundreds of pages. And I've read a lot of different writers, how they go about it, and each seems to be different. But that's because we can't really see that interests me. So I was just wondering, day to day, do you try to cover a certain number of pages? Do you Everyone does
Yeah.
it differently. Some
No.
are handwritten.
I'm really convinced that writers who say they write every day are lying to me. Like, I really try to believe it. Like, I'll tell myself, no, like, they must write every day, because I'm like, then why don't I write every day? So I think I feel better by convincing myself that they must be lying. But the day-to-day is that if I am drafting something, what I do give myself, some writers give themselves hours, right? Like, I have to write for 3 hours, 4 hours. Most writers will actually tell you they write 4 hours. Like, that's the limit, and then they're on to something else, whether it's research, whether it's reading. There's just other things to do. I usually have a word count goal that helps me. So if I was doing a first draft, then my word count goal is I need to hit 1,000 words a day, or I need to hit 2,000 words a day. So what I'm trying to do is get out of my own head as a writer and just write that first draft without the critic that comes in to tell you how terrible everything is that you're writing down. I mean, because that's what a first draft is. It's terrible, and like, that's something you don't always accept. I would say, as a writer, you're always pushing against that, and you're trying to make the prose beautiful. But why on the first draft when you might throw that away, or you might not end up using it? And so for me, daily, I try to, when I'm drafting, write 1,000 words. If I'm in a revision mode with a particular short story or with a novel, I'm not trying to hit a word count goal at that point. I'm just writing for hours. So there are times where it goes really, really well, and there are times when it doesn't go well at all. But I don't feel as if I have I don't know, I wanted to be that writer that could say they wrote daily, you know? But I want to be honest,
Yeah,
so.
me too.
One last question. Go ahead.
Oh,
Is there a plan to translate it into other languages in Nigeria? I know Nigeria, English is of course very widely spoken there, but I thought maybe there is?
not yet. Not yet, but that's what I've learned about foreign translations is that usually happens like 2 or 3 years after the novel has been out.
Right.
Yeah,
But even in Nigeria, for instance, would you consider translating it into?
into Baigi or
Yeah.
into. Yes. No, I would. I would consider that. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I have a frivolous question.
Yeah, sure.
Are mangoes as big a thing in Nigeria as in India?
Yes. They are. And it was really important to me that I used that particular fruit because I wanted to signal to the global south, you know.
Okay.
So that's why I used it.
Good. You had one more question. Go ahead.
What are you working on next?
Good question.
Yes. Thank you. Well, not historical fiction. I will be leaving that behind for now. I'm working on something that's more contemporary, a different voice and a different style than what this novel is right now. Yes, but I'm excited about it. Sorry, that's very cryptic,
No.
but like, you kind of keep your work close for a minute, and then there will be a certain point where I'll speak more widely about it. But you're always like, anything can happen. This could shift in any way.
It's embargoed.
Afa Kurian, thank you for
Thank you.
talking about Before the Mango Ripens. And Lisa, thank you for being such a great interviewer. Afa Kurian.